about the history of some of the aquatic invasive species infestations in the Adirondacks and spend a little time going over the characteristics of each of the individual plant species that we have and how you can tell them from our native species. As Aaron mentioned, we really want to take particularly good care of our native species while limiting the capabilities of the invasives. I've actually been working with this project for many years. Switch over to full-size view here. And when I started, we were actually dealing with 3 exotic plant species in the Adirondacks. And now, as you can see from this list, we have 10 on the list and a few others that we're actually looking into as well. Perhaps the most widespread distribution is Eurasian watermilfoil, and this is the one you're most likely to encounter. So we'll talk about this one fairly extensively. But we have other milfoils as well and a host of species to talk about today. I want to first back out a little bit and talk a little bit about plants in general. And primarily, I'm interested in having you see the column all the way to the right, and it relates to the arrangement of leaves on a stem, because many of our invasive species have fairly distinctive characteristics relative to leaf arrangement that you'll be able to use. And you can see there are 3 major categories. Alternate, meaning the leaves are not directly across from each other on the stem. They actually alternate sides. Then we have opposite, where the leaves are directly across. And perhaps the most important one from most of our invasives is what we call whorled, where the leaves actually form a ring completely around the stem, that lowermost image. And that would be our milfoil species and also our species of Brazilian Elodea and Hydrilla, another major species of concern. Let's start out with Eurasian watermilfoil, probably the most common species in the park right now. We actually have it in about 61 lakes. It started spreading fairly aggressively through our region back in the 1970s. And the reason this species tends to win the battle for space is that it actually grows very rapidly, and where it's stem elongation of up to 1 centimeter a day. Those stems can grow right to the surface of the lake, and I've encountered these plants with stems as much as 15 feet tall. So they can get quite tall, and then they grow laterally across the surface of the lake, creating a canopy. They shade out the native plants, and they win the battle for space by creating that shading. They also tend to grow in these really dense single species stands. As Aaron was talking about different ways that plants spread themselves around, Eurasian watermilfoil is dispersed primarily by fragmentation. That is, breaking off of small pieces of plant stem. These stems pieces will drift around for a bit. They often will even produce roots right on those stems, and we call them adventitious roots. After a week to a month, these fragments will sink to the lake bottom, and if they actually land in a place where they can grow, they'll start a new population of plant. What we see with Eurasian watermilfoil is every plant can produce hundreds of these little fragments every growing season. So they really are a very effective mechanism for spreading this plant around. And if you're out on your lakes or any lakes that have this plant present, you'll very frequently see small pieces of these plants drifting around. To give you an idea of how extensive the distribution of this plant is, it's pretty much throughout New York State. But if we notice, it tends to cluster along our major transportation corridors. You kind of look north and south along the eastern side of the state where our major interstates are. But we also have a barge canal system that includes the Hudson River, the Champlain Barge Canal, and the Erie Canal, which is a perfect water route to move a lot of our invasives around. And that's one of the reasons that they move so rapidly around the state. And if you look, you can kind of see that those Eurasian watermilfoil sites kind of match up with our distribution network. Another interesting thing is that we started to see a really major spread of invasive species back in the 1970s. And that was pretty much concurrent with completion of the Adirondack Northway in our part of the world and some of the other major water routes as well. So how does Eurasian watermilfoil differ in structure from many other plants, and how we can actually tell it apart? As I mentioned, the leaves tend to be in whorls around the stem. In other words, they grow in a circle around the stem. Each of the leaves very much looks like a feather. And this is a characteristic that will frequently take you to members of the milfoil group. So I can't emphasize enough, if you encounter a plant out there with leaves like a feather, let someone within the APIPP group know, because you frequently have found a milfoil. Interesting thing about the Eurasian that differentiates it from a lot of the other milfoils is if you look at the end of the leaf, it almost looks like they've been cut off squarely with a pair of scissors. Most of the other milfoils, the leaves will actually taper down to a point at the end. Another characteristic we often encounter with milfoils, because it grows so rapidly, it often produces stems that are red to pinkish in color. And sometimes so much so that they're almost a cherry pink color at the growing tips. It does produce flowers, and as I mentioned, it mainly spreads by fragmentation, but it can produce seeds. These flowers tend to stick above the surface of the lake, and they would remind you of a pipe cleaner, for those of you that know what a pipe cleaner is. But it basically is just a little tubular structure sticking above the surface of the lake, maybe 1/8 of an inch in diameter and up to a couple inches tall. Another characteristic of Eurasian water milfoil that tends to differentiate it from the other milfoils is the leaves tend to be pretty limp. If you pick up the plant out of the lake, the leaves will literally collapse around the stem. Some of our native milfoils that look a lot like the Eurasian will have much stiffer leaves, and when you take them out, the leaves will continue to stand out away from the stem. It's a good characteristic that you can use to tell the Eurasian variant from some of our native plants. A second species of concern is another milfoil, variable milfoil, perhaps the second most common of the invasive species in the Adirondack region. Again, like the Eurasian, the leaves are shaped like a feather and occur in whorls around the stem. This plant, much like Eurasian water milfoil, can grow pretty rapidly and reach the lake surface. You can kind of see what the flowers look like here, those structures that kind of are above the lake surface. This particular milfoil tends to produce very, very bushy plants, even more so than the Eurasian. Excuse me. And its principal dispersal pattern is through fragmentation, much the way Eurasian is. As you can see, this one tends to be clustered more in the Adirondack region of the state than throughout, and we have quite a few populations. It seems to like our climate. And at one point, there was some question whether this was a native species or not. We pretty much decided that it's an invasive. Once again, for this species, its leaves are whorled around the stem, same as the Eurasian. But if you take a look at the individual leaflets, you can see they don't have that square cutoff look at the ends the way the Eurasian plant does. The subleaflets also tend to be less exactly opposite each other, or less exactly feather-like than the Eurasian is. In this particular plant, the stems tend to be fairly thick and often more of a brown color than that bright reddish color that the Eurasian. Once again, these have flower stalks that stick above the surface of the lake, but they tend to be more toothed than the Eurasian and larger in diameter. Third species on our hit parade, and one that's probably the easiest of the invasive species to tell in the Adirondack region, is Eurasian or European water chestnut. If you take a look, this one has has triangular shaped leaves with great big teeth on it. There are literally no other plants in the region that look much like this at all. As far as this species goes, it tends to occur mainly in the perimeters of the park, but there are a few interiors, as Aaron mentioned earlier, where they're found. It is found in Lake George, Loon Lake, and Lake Alice in the interior. This plant produces these leaves on the lake surface. There's really nothing in the way of leaves below the lake surface, so we call it a floating plant or a floating floret. And on each of the leaflets, if you notice, there's a little bulb or inflated area that serves to help float these surface florets. These plants can grow exceedingly densely, particularly in the Lake Champlain drainage, and form dense canopies, once again winning for the battle for space by shading out the native plants. Interestingly, this plant is an annual. It actually has to come back from seed each year. And that sort of gives us a chance to be able to eradicate this species where we encounter it. Because if you can get to the plant and remove it before it produces its annual seeds, you can really damage the distribution of this species and reduce its growth. This one has had some success with hand pulling to eradicate it. Particularly, at one point, one population in Lake George was eradicated, and they'd come fairly close to eradicating it or significantly reducing it within the Hudson River drainage years ago. But they stopped managing it, and it just came back gangbusters. Here's the distribution of water chestnut. It's mainly in the Hudson drainage, and as you can see, it's on the fringe of the park. I don't have dots on this one for Lake George, Loon, or Lake Atlas yet, but those are the principal ones in the Adirondack region. Once again, you can see it's primarily within the Hudson River watercourse and the major transportation networks for the state. I'll keep mentioning that the way that these plants are spread around for the most part is probably through boats and trailers. Though this particular one may be moved by waterfowl as well. We've actually encountered water chestnut populations in fairly remote areas that would be unlikely to have any boat access. So this one could be spread around by waterfowl. It produces a fairly large black seed with big spikes all over it, and it will stick into the feathers of birds. The next one on our hit parade is a pondweed. It's called curly-leaf pondweed. Pondweeds are the most common aquatic plants within the park and come in a variety of shapes and sizes. This one tends to be around the periphery of the park, and it's got an interesting growth form. It actually starts growing in late fall or early winter under the ice, and it will grow slowly through the winter, and then as soon as ice goes out in the spring, it very rapidly grows, reaches its peak abundance in June or July, and then begins to collapse back. This one primarily spreads itself by producing what we call an overwintering bud or turiad. It looks like a little pine cone up there. You can see the photo in the lower right-hand corner. And these just fall off the plant, drop to the lake bottom, where they'll sit throughout the summer months and then sprout in the fall and start growing again. A very prolific plant. This is probably one of the earliest invasive species to show up in New York State. Probably came from Europe. And many people don't even become aware of this species because it goes through its whole life cycle while the waters are still fairly cold and before people are actively using the lakes. So this one is more collegiate than most of our invasive species as far as causing nuisances to us. The way you can tell this plant from most others is what I call the lasagna effect. If you look, the edges of the leaves are actually very deeply curled, much like the edge of a lasagna noodle. And there really are no other plants that have this deeply curved edge. It often has small teeth along the edge, but they're fairly difficult to see without magnification. This plant, like Eurasian watermilfoil, can get very tall, 12 to 15 feet tall, where it tends to grow at the deep margin of Eurasian watermilfoil growth in many of our lakes. It also produces under sediment runners, so the plant kind of has a creeping motion for spreading itself around. There are only a limited number of populations within the Adirondack Park, and because your surveys probably are starting a little later in the season, you may not even run across this plant, but it's quite a nuisance in the Hudson Valley. Here's to give you an idea again. Once again, the distribution patterns are very similar to the others, with the Hudson River Valley principal vector for moving this plant around, but it's pretty common throughout the western part of the state as well. It likes more alkaline calcium carbonate type waters that we have in the park, but there are a few locations here. Perhaps one of the newest and least common invaders in the park is a species called Fanwort. At the moment, we only know of it in 4 lakes in the southwestern corner of the park, and from there the distribution breaks until you get down around Long Island. It's kind of an interesting little plant, though. It tends to grow in deep waters in the lakes where it's found, from 25 to 30 feet deep, growing into perhaps 4 or 5 feet. It doesn't grow in the shallowest edges of the lake, we presume because it can't handle bright sunlight. This particular one probably came in from an aquarium dump at the end of the summer. One of the mechanisms for spreading invasive species around relates to people who set up small aquaria. They'll go to their local store, they'll buy some aquarium plants, and at the end of the summer they're tired of the aquarium, and they figure, oh well, we'll give these fish and plants a nice home, and they dump them in the lake. A pretty effective way to spread invasive species. Like most of the plants I've talked about, this one also spreads by fragmentation, small pieces of the plant breaking off, drifting around, and establishing new population. Here's what this species looks like. They call it fanwort because each leaf sort of looks like a fan. I kind of think of them as looking a little like a ginkgo leaf type. These particular leaves are opposite on the stem rather than whorled. That means that a pair of leaves will be directly opposite each other on the stems. The leaves tend to have little stalks before you get out to the leaf proper. And in our part of the world, they very rarely flower. In fact, most aquatic plants very rarely flower. Their spread is primarily by vegetative means, those fragments or overwintering buds or something like that. Here to give you an idea of the distribution of this one, that you see that small cluster in the southeastern corner of the park, and after that you have to go quite a ways before you encounter any others. That's why we think this one was spread around by some mechanism other than boat traffic. Next one in the group is called European frog, but this one's a little different. It actually looks like a very, very small lily pad. The photo here is of the frogbit growing over in the Champlain Barge Canal in an area of cattails. This particular species actually escaped from cultivation in Canada in the 1930s. That's another common way for invasive species to be introduced regionally. The same is probably true of water chestnut. And in fact, New York State, and particularly Schenectady, New York, may hold the dubious record of being the point of introduction for European water chestnut into New York State and the United States. A water garden there flooded into Collins Lake and got into the Mohawk River, where it spread pretty much rapidly around the state. The other possibility is the Harvard Botanical Garden. So it showed up in the Charles River in about the same time as it showed up in the Hudson back in the 1930s. This one, however, since its introduction, has kind of spread into the Great Lakes, spread down the St. Lawrence, and is creeping southward in the Champlain Barge Canal system. The closest introduction to us is actually in Whitehall, New York, in Great South Bay of Lake Champlain and the Barge Canal system. We tend to see this as present mainly peripheral to the park, though the Grass River introduction that Aaron mentioned earlier and subsequent eradication was within the regions of the park. This one produces little heart-shaped floating leaves. The leaves tend to be an inch in diameter or so. Produces a really dense tangle of stems beneath these leaves. This species will frequently flower and produces these little white flowers. So it's perfectly capable of dispersal by seeds or fruit, but it also produces those overwintering buds or turions that we spoke about with the other species, and it also is capable of fragmentation. So it's got all sorts of different ways of spreading itself around. But for this one, it's just very, very small pads like lily pads. And here's the distribution of European frogbit, primarily in the Champlain Lake system and Barge Canal system on the eastern edge of the park, though there is that one infestation within the park. We suspect that it's heading southward, though, and we'll probably ultimately end up in the Hudson River and throughout the state. This is Starry Stonewort is another species. It's a little different. This one is actually a macroalga rather than a true aquatic plant. And by that I mean that it doesn't have roots. It has what it has called holdfast, where it attaches to the lake bottom. And it actually gets all of its nutrition from the water column. It doesn't get nutrients through roots. So a somewhat smaller plant, but it grows in fairly dense tangles. And this one first showed up in the 1970s in the St. Lawrence. It's fairly heavily distributed in Michigan at the moment. We also are starting to see it spread around New York State. It was confirmed in Oneida Lake, which is part of the Erie Canal system, in the early 2000s, and has since spread a little into the canal system. So this one's kind of spreading itself around the state right now. There's not a lot to see with this plant because it is a macroalga, so it tends to be stringy. For those of you that are familiar with aquatic plants, it's the first cousin to a very, very common macroalga called Chara, which is present in most of our lakes and streams, exceedingly common within the Adirondack region. Another first cousin that's is called Nitella, a very important species in many lakes for maintaining lake clarity. This particular one, though, tends to grow along the water's edge in very shallow waters, generally less than 3 meters deep. And the way you can tell it from our native macroalga, or Chara, is it produces what are called rhizoids. They're these star-shaped structures that are present along the stems and help to secure this particular plant to the lake bottom. These rhizoids are perhaps the size of a BB, down to a large grain of sand. And that's one of the ways you can tell if it has these star-shaped structures attached to the plant, is an indication that this is an invasive species and not our native Chara. Pretty tough to discriminate. You're unlikely to encounter this species in your surveys. It's primarily present in the western part of the state because, as I said, it likes alkaline waters associated with limestone. And in the Adirondacks, we tend to be predominantly granite substructure, so you don't have a lot of carbonates in the water that this particular species likes. One of our biggest fears at the moment is this next species I want to talk about called Hydrilla. This species looks very, very similar to our most common native aquatic plant called Elodea. And it also has a first cousin called Brazilian Elodea, which is another native invasive species present in New York State. At one point, we all felt that Hydrilla would never reach our part of the world because it's a tropical species. We never thought it would be able to handle the temperatures that it would encounter in New York State. So at first we said, oh, it'll never cross the Mason-Dixon line. Well, that happened back in the 1970s. Then we said, okay, well, it'll never come into New York State because it's too cold here. And we had our first reported population about a decade ago. So it's slowly creeping northward and obviously becoming cold adapted in one way or another. It's present in a couple of the Finger Lakes right now and part of the Barge Canal system. This is a very, very rapidly growing species and a real concern, as this could be much worse than Eurasian water milfoil and actually has outcompeted Eurasian water milfoil in some parts of its range, to give you an idea. So we're very concerned about this one at the moment. And there's a very active prevention program going on. So how do you tell these guys from anybody else? As you can, let me start with Brazilian Elodea, one of the first three. This is perhaps one of the, at one point, was one of the most popular aquarium plants, and it was just available everywhere. We first started seeing this one in New York State in 2006, and now it's in about a dozen lakes, mainly Long Island and the southern tier, but we're fearful that it may move north over time. So we're asking people to keep an eye out for it. The question, how do you tell these three are native from these two invasives? Well, the particular native has leaves that are present as only 3 leaves, and they form a whorl around the stem. So at each whorl or node, there are 3 individual leaves present. When you look for the Brazilian Elodea or Hydrilla, both of those tend to have more than 3 leaves present at each leaf whorl. So if you see something that has more than 3 leaves present at the leaf whorl and looks like our native Elodea species, we really want to know about it. The leaves also tend to be smooth along the edge in the Hydrilla, whereas both Elodea and Egeria show some small, I'm sorry, I'm getting it backwards here. that Hydrilla actually has teeth along the margin. Elodea also does, but they're very, very small and hard to see. And Egeria has a smooth leaf edge. So there's some help there, but really the one thing that is fairly reliable is more than 3 leaves at each leaf whorl. So that's the real concern. If you see a plant that looks like this with more than 3 leaves at a leaf whorl, we want to know about it. And I'll tell you how to, or who to send plants to at the end of the talk. And I'm sure Aaron will go over that as well, about how to process plants and send them out for us to look at. There are also a few invasives that are relatively unusual around the state. Here's another milfoil called parrot feather. Again, it has the milfoil attributes. It has those leaves that are kind of arranged like a feather and whirled around the stem. But these happen to be bright green, and the part that you're looking at is actually growing above the lake surface. Very, very popular ornamental water gardening plant. At the moment, just present on Long Island. Again, we don't anticipate this plant getting this far north, but I make no guarantees. So if you see something that's bright green, sticking above the lake surface, and has leaves that are arranged like a feather, gather one and send it in. Be happy to look at it. Another relatively uncommon invasive species is called the yellow floating heart. This is a pretty showy plant. At the moment, it's only present in Lake Champlain in a limited number of spaces. Much like the European floating heart, the leaves are heart-shaped. These are a little bit bigger, approaching the size of lily pad-sized leaf, and it has these very dramatic yellow flowers, which are fairly easy to tell because none of our native species have anything that is quite this dramatic, though there is a species called spatterdock or yellow pond lily that does produce yellow flowers, but they don't really look anything like these. These tend to have flowers on long stalks, as you can see, and the underside of the leaves are purple. Much like many of floating leaf species, they tend to form fairly dense mats on the lake surface. I don't know as you'll encounter this species. I don't know of any of it in the interior of the park, but you never can tell. So we generally encourage people to at least be aware of this one. Another one that's fairly new, and may only be a native species that's undergoing a range extension since we've known about it in the Hudson Valley for decades, is a species called Brittle Naiad. Not a very dense growing plant. There's a native species called Northern Naiad, and there's a second native called Southern Naiad that are also present in our lakes. It forms these bushy little growths in shallow water. It tends to be found in lakes that use drawdown as a lake management technique. It's an annual species that comes back from seeds, and it's very good at invading these shallow water areas that have been exposed to freezing and thawing during the winter, which tends to destroy or damage most native and invasive aquatic plants for that matter. But this one seems to be able to thrive under those conditions. So you sometimes see it show up in shallow waters on lakes that do draw down. It's spreading fairly rapidly. We're not quite sure how. We suspect this may be a waterfowl issue since waterfowl are known to feed on these plants. And since they're annuals, they produce quite large numbers of seeds in the fall of the year. And so waterfowl migrating through may be moving the seeds of this species around. Here's to give you an idea of where Brittle Naiad is. Again, Hudson Valley, up into the Adirondacks, a few spots within the Adirondack Park itself. And almost all of these infestations in our region are fairly new within the last 10 years. We're also seeing it expand quite extensively over in Vermont. And since it's sort of on the Champlain flyway for waterfowl, we think that they may be a major vector for moving it around. There's a few other, I'll call them possible exotic species. Our problem with invasive or exotic species is that we say that the principal definition is that they weren't present here prior to European settlement. Well, that goes back quite a ways. We're not, and our surveys don't. So there's a few around that we're really not quite sure whether they're invasive species or they're simply expanding their ranges right now. One is this southern naiad, fairly similar to the brittle naiad that I just spoke to you about. There's quite a few lakes in the Adirondacks that have this species present. It actually is a nuisance species for a few of them, particularly Brant Lake down near Chestertown, where it forms kind of ropey, dense growth in the lake. They've actually worked at managing it a few times. Another one that showed up in the central Adirondacks a few years back is Utricularia inflata, one of the bladderworts. This was found in part of the Fulton chain. We don't know whether this is an invasive or not. We suspect that it might be, but it's relatively uncommon at this point, so we're just kind of keeping an eye out for it. Another species that a real panic showed up around was Didymo, a common name rock snot. This is actually a diatom, an alga that grows in flowing waters very densely. And there were some concerns that this was being imported by trout fishermen with their waders and fishing gear. And it showed up in a few streams in our region, notably the Cater-Ross down in Saratoga County, and a couple others. We're not quite sure that this just isn't a variant of one of our native diatoms run awry. So we're not quite sure about this species, so I threw it in the list as a possible exotic or invasive species without really knowing. So there's a lot of confusion about this particular one. And just a few others that are two of which are very, very common to the water gardening industry and have popped up occasionally in our part of the world. The water lettuce and the water hyacinths are tropical species. Very showy flowers on the hyacinth, and the water lettuce produces very dense cover on lake surfaces. The other one, Ludwigia, is another invasive that's showing up. That tends to be a water's edge species. I include these just to make you aware that there are others out there, but we don't anticipate you will encounter any of these. And that's pretty much what I had to tell you today. But I want to make sure you knew that if you do think you found an invasive species, please try and get a specimen to someone on the working group or anyone you know that is conversant. But I would say Erin is probably your first contact. Well, there's also a coordinator at DEC in Albany, Stephanie June, who replaced Scott Kishbaugh with the CSLAP program, or you can send them to me. Best way to do it is take the plant, put it in a paper towel, a moistened paper towel, and mail it to one of us. Or if you can deliver it, that's even better. The fresher, the better for an ID. I guess I'll conclude with saying if you run into plants that have leaves that look like a feather and are whirled around the stem, let us know, because that's a milfoil, and there are several of them out there that are rapid and invasive. That's
Great.
it.
Thank you so much, Larry. It is always a good point that, you know, we don't expect you all to know everything about, you know, how to ID invasive species after this presentation. We know, you know, there's a lot of information and great information in here, but it's more just to give you an idea of kind of what, you know, to I guess send up a red flag to be like, something that I see in this plant just reminds me of something that I saw in that presentation that Erin and Larry gave. We're just trying to, yeah, I guess, give you ideas of what to keep an eye out for when you're out either doing your survey or recreating on lakes and ponds. If you have any questions for Larry, feel free to put them in the chat box now. And then as people are putting in their questions, I'll start putting up the presentation. Next, we'll be talking about some of the invasive animals and how you identify those. Now we ever deal with purple loosestrife. And so purple loosestrife is a wetland invasive plant. And so I have a coworker who who's our terrestrial invasive species project coordinator. And so if a plant is a wetland plant or, you know, growing in the forest or highland, we group it into our terrestrial project. And so we do have staff. She is new. We hired her, I think, a couple weeks ago now, Becca Bernacki, and she does do work with purple loosestrife. And so I'd highly encourage those who are interested in learning more about terrestrial invasives to check out our training that we did yesterday on terrestrial invasives, and will be posted where we post this aquatic video, as well as I believe they'll be offering some additional trainings throughout this summer if that's of interest to you. And we'll be updating our events on our website for upcoming trainings that you can find. Okay. So without any additional questions on aquatic plants, I'll move into